Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and this week, in celebration of the upcoming Masters of the Universe movie that is right around the corner, we're going to be once again diving back into the Masters of the Universe series put out by DC Comics during the New 52 with Masters of the Universe, The Origin of Skeletor #1. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in December of 2012, we get a good look at the cover here with Skeletor's face front and center with some mystical looking smoke coming out of his eye sockets, which then turns into other notable faces from the Masters of the Universe series: Trapjaw, Triclops, Teela, Evil Lyn, He-Man himself. It's really simple, but I also believe that this does everything it needs to do as a cover. Given that this is an origin story for the character, we don't need a whole lot of pomp and circumstance around it. Front and center, you get Skeletor's face, you know what this is, and it's still detailed enough to kind of draw you in. And I also like the little fade effect that they gave the Masters of the Universe logo here, where some of the mystical smoke is in front of it. This is a really cool touch. And like I said, this covers nothing fancy, but I think it's really good for this book in particular. Now, as I mentioned, this is in fact a DC comic, which means that it has to start out with an ad. We see an advertisement for the Craftsman Bolt-On. I have no experience with these tools and would assume that a system such as this would have a lot of potential for failure. However, I looked it up before I recorded the video, and this thing still does exist, as do all these attachments, so they must be doing something right if they've continued making it for the last 14 years. And I'd have to assume that maybe if you're really pressed on space, this is potentially a better option for you rather than buying all of these tools separately. Though, that being said, you're going to pay a premium for it, as none of this stuff is cheap. These prices are high, folks, so keep that in mind if you're in the market for one of these things. Getting into the story, this starts out wonderfully. We see Keldor with his face already starting to melt, though we don't see what caused this. We do know that this, of course, is the event that leads him to becoming Skeletor, but this is the first time in this series that we're getting any kind of backstory explanation as to the events that happened involving all of this. Now, again, it doesn't show exactly who did this to his face or why, but we do see Keldor starting to struggle with a lot of memories from his past, as he had a real axe to grind with his father that he later turned on to his brother, Randor, who would become king of Eternia. His father, Miro, always saw Keldor as an inferior child, and always praised his brother Randor. And this eventually began to wear on Keldor, as he referred to himself as being known as Keldor the Bastard and Keldor the Half-Breed, when he wanted to be called Keldor the Wise, the Conqueror, and he wanted the accolades that came along with being the son of the king and eventually becoming king himself, though he was denied these things by a father who never truly accepted him as his heir, despite him being the eldest son of Miro. As Keldor works his way back up to his feet, we see that his face continues to burn and melt as he pulls his hood of his cloak up over his face to hide it. He thinks to himself that he'll be remembered as weak and as a liar and a betrayer, but then resolves that he will fix his legacy as he moves through a destroyed village which is consumed by flames. He then recognizes this village as the home of his father and a place that his father grew up and where he and his brother Randor played as children. He then starts to have himself reminded of memories that he had long since forgotten, of him and Randor playing here as children. However, we note that he brings up the idea that King Randor, the prince, was playing with his half-breed freak. Now, this will be important to remember for later. We also see that he remembers this as being the first time that one of Hordak's men ever appeared. And as this man appears, he immediately tries to grab Randor and kidnap him. However, Keldor quickly comes to his brother's aid and tries to stop this mysterious man from making off with his brother. Hordak's man immediately backhands Keldor, knocking him to the ground. However, Keldor refuses to allow his brother to be taken, as he once again grabs his sword, jumps back to his feet, and slashes the man across the arm, causing him to release Randor. He then raises his sword above his head, trying to deliver the final blow, when he is immediately stopped by Prince Randor, who tells him, "No, Keldor, we do not kill." Which would suggest that these two boys were not playing with wooden swords that they had made themselves. These were actual live blades, which seems like a real indication of the lack of supervision they had, and does lend some credence to the idea that King Miro may not have been the best father. We then get an advertisement for Arrow on the CW. I've talked about this in the past. I'm not the hugest fan of Arrow. It wasn't a terrible television series by any means, but I feel like the longer it went, the worse it got. That's just my opinion. If you're a big Arrow fan, I get it. You know, it was definitely catered to a certain audience, and that audience was not me. We then see Randor subdue the man as he ties his hands behind his back and tells Keldor that their father will interrogate this man and find out who sent him, as the memory fades back to Keldor as an adult. As Keldor continues to make his way through the flames, he simply says, "I must find Randor," as we see smoke still billowing from his face out from underneath the cloak, as whatever has been done to him continues to melt his face away. He falters and realizes that he's starting to lose his vision. This, of course, is being caused by this undescribed force melting his face, now getting to his eyes and causing him to lose his sight. As he looks ahead, he starts to have a vision of his brother in black and white as the king of Eternia, as he simply says, "brother." We then get an advertisement for the Green Lantern CG animated cartoon that took place on Cartoon Network. I vaguely remember this. If I remember correctly, I might have watched like the first episode of this show, and I don't recall it necessarily being bad. It was just that it was made for a much younger audience, and that's fine. I mean, it's on Cartoon Network. Not everything has to be for adults, and, you know, it was clearly directed at children. I don't recall whether or not this series ran for very many seasons. I don't seem to remember it doing so, maybe one or two. If you have any memories of this show and it was something you watched a lot as a child, or maybe even as an adult with a child, let me know if it was any good. It didn't seem like it was bad from the one episode I watched, but then again, it might have really gone downhill after that, and I'm interested in knowing more about this if you have any info. Keldor then slips back into another memory, this one being far closer to the present, as we can see both he and Randor are adults. This memory comes just after their father, King Miro, has died and left the throne to Randor instead of Keldor. Randor tries to put a positive spin on this, stating, "I can't wait to have you as my chief advisor, brother. Your wisdom will make my reign long and prosperous." However, Keldor is severely disappointed by this news, as he says father's last wish, but he's interrupted by Randor, who says, was to have me as king and you as my top advisor. However, Keldor states, "But I'm the eldest." And at this point, Randor is forced to deliver the heartbreaking news to his brother that he was trying to avoid, as we see him look rather distraught. He tells Keldor, "Yes, brother, but your Gar blood means..." And we are then teleported back to the future, where Keldor says, "My Gar blood means that I was never good enough for him, or for you, or for anyone." As he continues along the path that he is traveling on, he once again slips back into a memory of his childhood, where we see the two boys, Randor and Keldor, leading the captive would-be kidnapper sent by Hordak along a path to their father. Randor says, "Thank you once again, brother. You've been so good to me, and you absolutely saved my life back there." Keldor tells him not to worry about it, as he would have done the exact same for him. We then see Keldor in the present looking upon this memory of he and his brother leading the captive man up a staircase, as he says, "No, I can't take that path just yet," as he instead takes a different staircase to a subterranean room, as he says, "My destiny." He then places his hand on a wall and begins to have another memory, this one coming just after being informed that he would not be king, as we see him plug a strange glowing wire into his neck and the wall in front of him. He then recites a strange incantation of words that have no meaning to me, other than the final word that he says, which is a familiar name, that of Hordak. I find all this interaction rather intriguing, as we can see through many of these memories that Randor was nothing but loving and gracious to Keldor, and that he was actually rather upset at the fact that his father passed Keldor over for the role of king, and that he even at one point tried to argue on his brother's behalf, but his father would not allow it, given that Keldor was half Gar. Now, we're not given much information about the Gar in this comic book, though we can tell by Randor's sad reaction and the actions of his father Miro that there is seemingly some sort of contentious relationship between the humans and the Gar, and that there is some sort of potential racism being displayed here, that his father would see Keldor as inferior or not fit for the throne in some way due to him being half Gar. And I find this odd, given the fact that Keldor even brought up that his mother was apparently not married to King Miro, as he calls himself the bastard son of King Miro. Now, seemingly this in and of itself would have been enough to prevent him from taking the throne, but it was actually more so his being half Gar that prevented him from ascending to the throne as King Miro's eldest son. So this does in fact really kind of reiterate the idea that there is some level of real disdain for the Gar people by the humans on Eternia, bordering on the level of racism that it would have prevented Keldor from being king. After Keldor recites the incantation, we see a portal appear before him on the wall, and the strange glowing cord connected to his neck go through the portal. A voice on the other side of the portal starts off very angry, but then realizes who they're speaking to and says, "Ah, Keldor, son of Miro, brother of Randor, congratulations on your ascension." However, at this time, Keldor states, "The old fool passed me over and made Randor king, just as you said he would, Lord Hordak." Hordak then responds by stating that, "Well, but you're the eldest and the strongest and the smartest." But Keldor tells him, "I am impure." Upon hearing this, Hordak states, "No, you are not. You are better than any of those who have come before you, and you already know that, which is why you made contact. I will help you claim what is yours, boy." We then move back to the present, where we see Keldor's face melting more and more by the moment, his nose now gone, along with his eyelids and most of his mouth, as he says, "I must find Randor." As he begins to ascend the staircase back out of the room, he looks back and sees a vision of himself as a child, whipping and torturing the man who tried to kidnap Randor, stating, "Talk, swine, tell me who sent you." However, at this point, the memory turns to Keldor, and his younger self says, "It's time." This catches Keldor off guard, as he simply says, "What?" And the younger version of himself says that it's time to accept your fate. Keldor tries to argue that he is in control of his own fate, but his younger self tells him there is only one master. This, of course, happens as we see tendrils coming out of the Horde soldier who was being tortured by the younger version of Keldor and attaching themselves to Keldor. Now, seeing as how we've learned that Keldor was in contact with Hordak throughout much of his childhood, and we are now seeing this image of these tendrils attaching themselves to his body when he was a child, it would lead us to potentially consider the idea that this character was not sent to kidnap Randor, but was sent to be captured and then begin the corruption of Keldor, leading him to become one of Hordak's minions. As Keldor turns and once again begins to descend the staircase, he seemingly starts to second-guess himself as he says, "The mistakes I've made, what have I done?" as we see him falter and fall down the staircase, envisioning himself shattering as he impacts the ground. We then see him wake in an ethereal world where a figure looking like a skeleton wearing a robe greets him. He then asks, "Is this?" And the figure says, "Yes, you have crossed over. I am Death." However, Keldor immediately protests, stating, "No, I can't be dead now. I have to find Randor." The figure known as Death then states, "What could a pitiful little speck like you ever do?" This immediately enrages Keldor as he grabs Death by the robes and screams, "How dare you? I am Keldor the Great, and the world will tremble before me," as he smashes Death's skull against a rock. I find it interesting that Keldor has second guesses about the path that he's taken, given that, he's betrayed his entire kingdom and is now on the verge of death, to the point where he actually crosses over at one point, but then still remains defiant as he seemingly refuses to admit that he could potentially be in the wrong and is consumed by the idea that he should be king and that the world should kneel before him. This was apparently enough to will himself back to life, as we see Keldor wake and get himself back onto his feet, stating, "I must find Randor," as he once again ascends the staircase out of the subterranean room. As he makes his way towards the royal throne room, he once again has a memory of his childhood. This one where Randor tells him that he tried his best to explain to their father that Keldor was the one who captured the kidnapper, but Keldor tells him, "Don't worry about it, I don't need the accolades." However, Randor pleads with Keldor, stating, "Please, brother." We then see Keldor round the corner into the royal throne room as he slowly approaches the throne. He then once again remembers his childhood when he and Randor presented the kidnapper that they captured to their father. And while King Miro tells them that he is proud of them both, he immediately begins to shower all of his praise onto Randor, stating that he couldn't be happier with the bravery that his son displayed. However, Randor does his best to try and convince his father that it was actually Keldor who captured this man and that he saved Randor's life in the process. However, Miro seems to want to hear none of it and tells Randor that it's very kind of him to try and share the praises with his older brother, but that it is in fact one more instance in which Randor has proved that he is the one deserving to be king. Randor, of course, is not happy to hear this, as he desperately tries to plead with his father to listen to him. However, at this point, the memory that Keldor is experiencing is interrupted when he hears his name called out to him. We then see that the person who called out to him was none other than King Randor himself, who immediately expresses concern for Keldor as he asks, "Brother, what happened to you?" Keldor simply responds by stating, "You know," which unfortunately doesn't give us any more insight as to who exactly it was that started melting his face off. We also notice that King Randor's sword is soaked in blood and he is donning his armor, which would infer that he is coming from the heat of battle. He then expresses concern for Keldor's well-being as he states, "We must get you to a healer." However, Keldor tells him that it's too late for that now. Randor then goes down to his knees, trying to get closer to his brother, and asks, "What happened? What made you betray us? Please help me set this right." However, Keldor responds by saying, "I did what had to be done. The rightful ruler of Eternia must be brought forth." Randor tries to rebut this by stating Hordak is not the rightful ruler of Eternia, but Keldor responds telling him, "Not Hordak, me." This, of course, brings us to the conclusion that Keldor, in fact, led the Horde to Eternia's gates and was trying to help the Horde in overthrowing the crown, betraying not only his brother, but all of Eternia in the process. Randor then states, "But Agar can never be king." However, Keldor responds by shouting back, "Not Agar, me. We share blood. We share everything. I sat back and watched you rule while I prayed for our father to notice me, for women to desire me, and for the people who should be my subjects to accept me as their king." Randor tries to sympathize with his brother, stating, "I know that this is unfair, but you were to rule by my side, yes, underneath me, but not because you were inferior, but because I needed your help to stay standing, and without your help, I am lost." Keldor responds by stating, "Then you are lost, brother." Randor puts his hand onto Keldor's shoulder and states, "You will not die here." However, Keldor tells him, "Look upon my face and say that to me," as he pulls back his hood to reveal that almost all of the flesh has melted away from his skull. Randor is understandably shocked by this sight as he tries to remain positive, stating, "We will get an enchantress." However, Keldor puts his hand on his brother's shoulder and tells him it's too late for that. "The only thing I ask now is that you not let me die alone and that you forgive me." Becoming very distraught at the idea that his brother is dying in front of him, Randor simply says, "I forgive you, brother, for all of it, for your betrayal, for the war you've started. And if I had only been a better brother to you and a better friend, maybe this could have been prevented." However, he is interrupted when Keldor states, "No, I don't want you to forgive me for that. I want you to forgive me for this, because this is the only way," as we see Randor scream out, "What?" We then see that Keldor has in fact plunged his dagger into the guts of his younger brother, telling him that he needs his blood for it is the key. He then rises to his feet and bids Randor farewell as he tells him they will never meet again as he steps through a portal that opens up behind him, leaving Randor alone, wounded on the floor of the throne room, screaming no. As Keldor passes through the portal, with his dying breath, he exclaims to two Horde soldiers that they inform Hordak that he succeeded. We then see his body laid out on a table in front of Hordak with many tendrils connected to it, as Hordak stands next to him holding the dagger brought to him by Keldor. He then states that while Keldor is now dead, he was able to bring a great weapon to them to use against their enemies. And as a reward for this gift, he will return a gift to Keldor, that gift being life. However, he then says, "Farewell to you, Keldor, son of Miro, brother of Randor, and rise my new apprentice." Also, I'd like to bring up, I didn't say it before, but I was really surprised to see Hordak depicted in this manner. As you can see here, this is not like we've ever seen him depicted before, with his armor being on and perhaps one of his arms being like a laser cannon. This depiction is more so that of a monster or a demon of some sorts, and is really not even remotely similar to any way I think he had ever been depicted before this issue of this book. And on the final page of the story, Hordak exclaims, "Rise, my Skeletor," as we get a really cool full-page splash image of the newly resurrected Keldor as Skeletor, the way we know him today. And we also finally get the credits to this book that DC didn't seem to be too concerned about at the front of this book because they were too busy simping for freaking Craftsman tools. Writer, Joshua Hale Falcon. Art and cover, Fraser Irving. Lettering, Dave Sharp. Editor, Michael McAllister. Special thanks to Ben Abernathy. We then get an advertisement for Superman Earth 1 Volume 2 in the trade paper form. I didn't read any of Superman Earth 1, or really almost any of Superman at all in the New 52, but if you did, let me know how it was, because I'm kind of interested if it was any good or not. We then get a multi-page string of ads for another DC title, as the first page says, "Power corrupts, power seduces. Power consumes, but power is finite." And cut deep enough, even a man of steel can bleed. We then see that this has all been more advertisement for Superman Earth 1 Volume 2. Because why stop at one page for an advertisement for a single trade paper when you could instead devote 6 pages to an advertisement for a single trade paper? We then get a 2-page advertisement for Wave 3 of the New 52, which contains a bunch of the pencils from a lot of the titles involved in the New 52. Most notably, of course, pencils from the pages of Grifter, which was one of the few New 52 books I actually kept up with, which of course should be a surprise to no one as much as I like that character. And I am glad to actually see these, despite the fact that the New 52 as a whole is not something I really cared that much about. I do like having the ability to look upon some actual pencil work from the Grifter series, so this was a cool ad to come across for me. On the final page of the book, we get an advertisement for Ghost #1 trade paper from DC All Access. I am unfamiliar with any of the titles that are involved in any of this, so I can't really speak on it, but if you can, feel free to talk about it in the comments below because I'd like to know more. And on the reverse inside cover, we get an advertisement for collegehumor.com because that was popular at the time. Unfortunately, its popularity would wane as this website no longer exists. And that was Masters of the Universe, The Origin of Skeletor #1. And I forgot to mention when I started this video that this is not actually a #1. There are no issues that come after this, and there were never supposed to be. This is a one-shot. I don't know why DC didn't just call it a one-shot and instead decided to call it a #1, but that apparently was what they were doing at the time. Overall, I really like this book a lot. It gives us so much story and backstory and information regarding Keldor and his journey to becoming Skeletor, while also leaving the door open for a lot of other story points to be brought in at a later time, as there's still some questions that go unanswered. We start out with the idea that Keldor slowly became very upset by the fact that his father scorned him and didn't truly love or accept him for who he really was, and that this is what led him to becoming Skeletor. But then we get introduced to the idea that he was also being manipulated by Hordak throughout this entire journey. However, we also see that it wasn't just the manipulations of Hordak that were playing into this, as Skeletor was also convincing himself of things that weren't necessarily true. Obviously, he bemoans Randor for becoming king, but as we saw throughout all of his memories, Randor was nothing but gracious to Skeletor throughout their entire childhood, and even tried to speak to their father on Keldor's behalf that he should be the one that was the rightful heir, and that he should have been the one to take the throne and rule over Eternia. And it was his father that was like, no, he's a Gar, he can't be king of Eternia because of that. And while we did see Randor eventually go along with Miro's thought process in this, he also never actually looked down upon Keldor in any way, even telling Keldor as he was dying that he never saw himself as better and that he needed Keldor's wisdom to help guide him in his rulership. So some of it was in fact Keldor's own envy that led him to the point where he would betray the entirety of Eternia and go into the arms of Hordak willingly. And then we also get the whole side that once he became Skeletor, it was after he had died. So this is actually a new part of the story where we realize that Skeletor is in fact an undead minion of Hordak, which is a completely new take on the idea of Skeletor. However, I think it makes a lot of sense given that you've got a guy who's walking around with an exposed skull for a head. He shouldn't be able to live like this. And him being explained as being undead makes a lot more sense than just us accepting this idea of, hey, this guy was Keldor, his face melted off, but somehow he still survived, because realistically, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense at all. But then again, these are just my opinions. You might think that the story in this book was silly and unnecessary, and that the lore we had about Skeletor prior to this would have been plenty to go on. You also may not like the idea of Skeletor now being presented as undead and think that that's kind of like over-explaining something that we could have just accepted without that explanation. And if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinion. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.